we'll start. Hi everybody, thank you for joining today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alicia Wanless. Alicia is the director of the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which aims to foster evidence-based policymaking for the governance of the information environment. And today she's going to present a CERN model for studying the information environment. So thank you so much, Alicia, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and a special thank you to Dr. Lewandowski for setting this up. I'm sure many of you know they have also called for a CERN approach to disinformation a few years ago in their report. So this is a shared idea that I think has been bubbling up from the community for a while. So just by way of background information, if I can make this go. Excellent. So my own research has been looking at how the information environment can be studied similarly to the physical.
Sorry, Alicia, you're sharing the wrong screen. If you just click swap displays at the top, at the very top, swap displays, that'll fix it. There you go.
Interesting. Thank you. It is first thing in the morning. I'm in Canada, and I need that second cup of coffee, clearly. So as I was saying, my research has been looking at other models to try to study the information environment, specifically looking to physical ecology to see if there are ways for us to study ecosystems, make observations on them, understand what kind of factors might be shifting, especially after we introduce new technology, and what kind of disturbances might be occurring there. In my day job, I've been running a program that I created 3 years ago called Partnership for Countering Influence Operations. It's a multi-stakeholder initiative aimed at fostering evidence-based policymaking for the information environment. And in the 3 years that we've been running it, we've engaged more than 900 stakeholders across sectors to try to get to certain answers. What we did in the first couple of years was really map who was doing what in the space to understand what was already being done. We did quite a lot of meta studies on things like policies that companies had put out, interventions they were making. We also had Princeton do a few meta studies looking at the academic literature around the impact of a threat like disinformation, as well as what was known at the time about the impact of interventions. The long story short is that we don't actually know too much. A lot of the academic literature was on fact-checking, pre-bunking, and disclosure at the time, although there has been a trickle coming in of things looking at deplatforming, for example. But on the whole, we haven't really perhaps advanced that far when it comes to understanding how digital technologies in particular may have changed things. So what in general is the problem that we've kind of identified? We live in an information environment. Now, I take a very broad definition of what that means. This is the space where humans and machines process information to make sense of the world. It includes the means of communication like television, the internet, and gaming, as well as all the technology behind those channels and the content that's created and shared through it. So that can include songs, videos, social media posts. And the information environment is extremely important to society because it's the place where decision-making occurs, and as such is inextricably linked to the physical environment. But just like the physical world, the information environment is polluted, and a polluted information environment affects public decision-making. I think we've all been able to see that in the last few years, clearly. Its integrity, the information environment's integrity, is integral to the very legitimacy of democracy, whereby humans need to make free and informed decisions. So missteps in governing the information environment lead to slips in authoritarianism. We're also seeing this across many democracies. Some of the most called for interventions are from an authoritarian handbook in terms of content moderation and banning users. And what's worse is that the clearest guidance on governance of the information environment seems to be coming from authoritarians right now, and many democracies are following suit because some of the leading democracies haven't really articulated principles for governance of that space that could act as a model to follow. And we've seen that in the response to the resolution on disinformation at the UN a couple of years ago. It went through by consensus because the like-minded democracies actually couldn't get enough support for major changes or something else. So the problem, the way I see it, is that the problem is how we approach the information environment in democratic societies. In many democratic societies, we're attempting to understand the information environment through its component parts or problems within it. So we tend to work in silos within silos. In addition to trying to build a multinational research facility, which I will talk more about later, we've also been running a multi-stakeholder crisis response network in Ukraine, and among other things. And we've really seen that stakeholders don't really understand each other across sectors. So we have differences in terms of how we talk and look at things between government, academia, and civil society. I will have a tendency to refer to both of those as civil society as we go forward, but just to make it clear, we do see differences in terms of how each of those actors work, and then across to private sector as well. I don't need to tell you guys that there is a lack of trust, especially when it comes to other actors like industry. And so this can make it really challenging for us to get on the same page. But we also have issues between disciplines. If different disciplines are approaching the information environment from their own field, with their own methods, with their own terminology, that is a small snapshot of the fields that would be covering aspects of the information environment. And then when we look at singular actors, especially like governments, we end up having silos within silos. So there's differences between mandates and what each type of stakeholder within stakeholders is looking at. But we also haven't really systematized knowledge of the information environment, and it lacks consilience. As I mentioned, we've got many different stakeholders coming from many disciplines. There's a proliferation of definitions and terms, and often we just really aren't even speaking the same language when we're talking about the same thing. And approaching research is done inefficiently at the moment. Research teams tend to be building their own data pipelines to do their own studies. They're building their own tools to make that happen. It's very costly. Engineering and infrastructure costs are soaring. We're all competing with industry to hire engineers and data scientists, and that can be really challenging for even the most established and well-off institutions. And funding is project-based. So this makes longer-term analysis of impact, whether that be impact of a threat or impact of intervention, a lot less feasible. So it's a lot harder for us to really understand what works and what doesn't, and what are the unintended consequences of those interventions. And then add to that, we tend to tackle problems within the information environment in piecemeal. So we look at a specific technology. Usually it will be the latest thing, or perhaps a platform like Twitter used to do, giving us more access to data to be able to look at it. We tend to look at types of threats. So disinformation is the latest one that's had a lot of attention, but before that it was looking at countering violent extremism, but we'd look at these pretty singularly. We also tend to focus on specific threat actors, whether those be nation states or, as I mentioned, extremists. And it also tends to get focused around events. So we're fairly reactionary across stakeholders. So we might look at it in the context of elections or natural disasters or conflicts. But this piecemeal focus is also really easily politicized. This is something that we're seeing quite heavily in the US right now, the politicization of the disinformation research field and attacks on those researchers seems to be pretty coordinated. So this piecemeal focus doesn't just keep us from seeing the bigger system. It's easily politicized and then leads some governments to actually not do anything anymore. But to get ahead, we have to be strategic. That's where my war studies hat comes in. And that requires really seeing the system over a longer term. Strategy is about making the best choices from an array of options within an operating environment. And we can't be strategic until we see the information environment for what it is, a complex and dynamic system. And we can't understand it unless we study it like a system over a longer period of time and beyond single case studies. So what's needed? To meet the increasingly pressing needs to safeguard the information environment, democracies need a multinational research facility. We've been calling it an Institute for Research on the Information Environment. Obviously, it doesn't exist, so I'm quite open on terms here. But the idea is that we can scale up research across institutions by connecting disciplines and providing shared engineering resources and capacity building across a wide range of the world's democracies. Fortunately, there is a model. After the Second World War, European science was suffering. So scientists were leaving the continent for a variety of reasons. And to attract them back in the late 40s, a transatlantic group of scholars proposed the creation of a world-class physics research facility in Europe, which now we all know as the CERN, or the European Center for Nuclear Research. The grand vision was this center would unlock the mysteries of the universe. And they laid out their plans in a white paper. And now the center supports fundamental research in physics across an international community with 23 member states and more. We need this type of large-scale collaboration once again to connect scholars internationally and accelerate research. This time, we'd be unlocking the mysteries of the information environment. Of course, there are other possible model institutions that can be explored. One of the reasons why the CERN is so compelling is given the role of the information environment in democracy. There is a concern that should any single country, if they could afford it, create something like this, it really is got a greater potential for abuse. And because there's always a risk of countries backsliding, no matter how stable the democracy, I think that that's a growing concern. And my cat has decided that he's going to join us for the rest of the presentation, apparently. So how would this compare between the CERN and something like IRI? As I mentioned, this would be trying to encourage engineers to study the information environment. So this is about bringing back expertise to help speed up research. The vision would be based around science for democracy as opposed to science for peace. So this isn't just about studying threats or the interventions to them. It would also be trying to understand the role of the information environment in democracies and what other tweaks can be made to strengthen democracy. I think too often we look at this from a threat perspective, and that's very reactive. And it doesn't necessarily get us to the point of understanding what makes a healthy information ecosystem in the context of democracy. And we would be similarly scaling up shared resources and infrastructure to be able to speed up research. But the other main difference here would be we would be connecting scientists, policymakers, and civil society. So this would have to be a multi-stakeholder initiative. And I'll get to why that's necessary in a little bit. So the reason why we think that there's an opportunity to actually make this happen now is coming off of the DSA. There is a greater impetus and interest. We've been seeing this across governments. We work closely with the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism, for example, on that project in Ukraine. And this is the first time in 6 or 7 years that I've been working on this that I've seen governments looking for solutions and even interested in something at this scale. I think added to that, the teams that are dealing with the DSA and things like the Code of Practice are finding it very hard to answer things like, how do you do risk audits? And how do you actually measure the impact of interventions to understand whether they're working? And so there's a greater need for that kind of support. And we've also seen some of the countries try to create their own shops to be able to measure those things. But why does this thing need to be multi-stakeholder? I can imagine that a group of seasoned academics might be wondering. I'm going to take an example of the European Commission's Code of Practice on Disinformation to just walk through all of the different stakeholders that would need to be involved. If you're not familiar with this is the voluntary reporting process on interventions to disinformation. Signatories share what they're doing to counter disinformation and metrics on their impact if they know them. Given some of the reporting that's been happening, I'm not even sure that that data is very much available even from the companies. Now, I'm a big proponent of the COP. A couple of years ago, as I mentioned, we had Princeton do some meta-studies for us, and they looked at 223 academic studies on the efficacy of interventions to disinformation. And the fact is we don't know a whole lot. They've been trickling in, as I said, on interventions like deplatforming, but we need to have a lot more research to understand the impact of content moderation. So if done right, the Code of Practice can help provide more insights, but what would that take? I think we're partway there. At least the idea exists. We have reporting, and the initiative was created mostly by civil society driving it, but with support from government. The reporting happens by both civil society and industry, which is an interesting mix, but you've got a bunch of nonprofits who have been making interventions and contributing reports. But also the emphasis that most people care about, I think, is really on what industry is doing. So Facebook, Google, et cetera. The submissions go to the team within the European Commission that looks at that. Now, what do we have to do in order to get towards more measurements of that? The team is small. They do try to compile all the reports and make sense of them, but they don't necessarily have the capacity to do more. So they're looking to civil society to support them. Unfortunately, civil society can't do that for free, so we require funding. And if we want to try to keep integrity of the entire process and that the results can be trusted, that funding can really only come from one source. It's got to come from governments or philanthropy. And there aren't a lot of philanthropies to go around, so that's not really a sustainable model either. They need tools. So some of these tools are created by civil society and academics, as I mentioned, on their own. Some of them are coming from industry, but then they also need data to be able to study that. And that's pretty much only coming from industry, although you have some data repositories that are popping up. Their ability to share between institutions is really challenged, especially by terms of service and other issues. But also, let's not forget where the data comes from. I think this is often overlooked, that it's generated by people, and we're not really engaging citizens all too much in that process. Now, industry might be doing some of these measurements, but I doubt they're doing much of that, actually, having worked inside one of the companies and also seeing what's happening in the Code of Practice reports. And there are government-funded centers popping up, like the European Center for Algorithmic Transparency and CERN in France, which is an agency that the French government set up to measure the impact of regulation that that country has introduced related to digital platforms. But just because the companies are hated doesn't make the governments loved. In fact, we have a massive decline in trust of government across many democracies. This comes from the Edelman Trust Barometer. So these two alone, government and industry, researching interventions in the information environment, isn't going to deliver the trust that we need right now. And neither is, sadly, relying on the media. That was just me being snarky. But if we want to have integrity in the information environment, if we want to rebuild trust in the information environment, particularly across the citizenry, we have to have civil society at the table, including academia, obviously. And given the imbalance of power that both government and industry have, that's going to require independence. But what I really mean is supported independence over a longer term. What democracies badly need is some means to facilitate collaboration that ensures the independence of researchers and supports policymaking, but doesn't leave us beholden to those actors with greater power. So how can this happen? We've been taking this as a community building exercise. So for the last year, Jake Shapiro at Princeton University and I have been exploring different models and options and what would be necessary to speed up research on the information environment in the context of policymaking. And what we've settled on is that the probably only way that we can get forward is through a community. So building a community whereby researchers and policymakers articulate their needs. What do they need to get ahead on measurements research? What kind of measurements gaps exist at the policy level with the regulators? What would they need to know in order to have rules for governing the information environment that makes sense? If we build up a community, not only can we show to our various governments that there is a demand for such a center, but we can distribute the burden on answering questions to develop something like IRE. This is really key because we've identified at least 15 questions that stand out that need to be answered. Things like, what are the ethics of this type of research conducting it? What's the life cycle of data? Should people be able to take back their data? How do we engage citizens? How do we increase diversity? And if a small group of people from elite organizations try to answer all these questions on their own, it's going to take years. And we don't have years. We're in peril now, unfortunately. So coming together allows us to answer these things faster and build that community of support. But also, we'd like to keep the door open for the community to share existing resources in the form of data repositories and infrastructure. Key here, though, is that such a model, a CERN for the information environment, has to be additive. So much of what we're doing is very competitive and it's not allowing us to scale up. So this needs to be additive to speed up research across a variety of institutions and countries. I like to think about this as a tent model. So if IRE is the grand vision that we're trying to work towards, it may never happen. If it doesn't happen, the act of community building may also change how we look at research. So on one hand, we would have a council. So these are people who step forward to answer questions informing IRE's development. We also have partners. So that would include the donors who want to make this kind of work happen, people who hold the problem. So these are the policymakers, regulators inside governments. Eventually, if we can figure out a model that works, that does not compromise our research, finding what those problems are in industry would also be helpful. So we can try to help answer what types of interventions would actually make sense for them. People who are already building data repositories. There are pockets of this across Europe and North America. How do we engage people who have already been making data sets that could be shared, that we could use to add to further research and build from the ground up systematically, but also people who have been building tools. So there are many who want those to be available to a wider group of researchers. It's hard to find out who has what. That, again, hasn't really been categorized in a great way either to make that easier. And lastly, we have a great community who's already doing measurements research. So how do we foster them and connect them across disciplines and encourage collaboration? And lastly, we really need to keep the door open. I can't stress this enough. As we've kind of gone down this rabbit hole, the things that any single person looking at this might not know is key. So I would say that this whole process is very inductive. There may be questions that emerge that we hadn't even thought of from our perspectives or vantage points. And we want to keep that council as open as possible so that new ideas that may need to be addressed later have a space at the table. I think this is also really key in terms of imbalance and diversity as well. So to wrap up, what are some of the next steps and how we're doing this? I think the goal in the next few months is to find a home for a council secretariat. The other lesson learned is that multi-stakeholderism is hard, demanding, and this community is growing quickly. So we definitely need to find some support and a house where a council with staff can be supported. This is likely to take the shape of I would guess, possibly a new nonprofit. That would have staff that can support a broad range of working groups and bring those people together. In tandem to this, we are building the council. There have been many people step forward already willing to take on some of the key issues. We are looking for more. We continue to try to engage community of partners. And again, I can't stress this enough. We need to make sure that door remains open and that people can find their space within it. And then together, this community will collectively work towards developing a plan for IRE. Eventually, what would be wonderful is by the time the countries come in to say that they can support this, which I would expect would take maybe a year to 2 years, having some sort of detailed plan in place for how this would operate would really kickstart things. And lastly, we're asking that the community champion this with democratic governments. So expressing as they see support for this, the need for it at their own governmental level to try to get other countries in. If 30 countries were able to come forward with $1 million a year over a longer term commitment, this becomes manageable, sustainable, and less easy to politicize. So I will stop there and would love to hear your thoughts, ideas. Maybe Stephen would like to say something.
Yeah, sure. If you no problem. First of all, thanks very much. Brilliant presentation. Just condensing it all in 25 minutes. Amazing. Very good. Obviously, as everybody here knows, I'm very supportive, and I think all the people I work with are extremely supportive. I think the steps that you've outlined make a lot of sense. The questions you've developed in the document, I think it was called the Council for Consilience or whatever, they also make a lot of sense. So I'm totally, very excited about it. Having said that, there's also some issues that I'd like to raise that I think we need to resolve. Obviously, I guess the first one is, where do you see us sitting relative vis-a-vis other similar efforts and related efforts in different dimensions? So let me be specific about that. First of all, what do you envisage the role of governments to be? What do you envisage the role of the business community to be? And by that, I mean the tech companies specifically. For example, are you prepared to take funding? Should we take funding from tech? Then we have other outfits that are sort of similar, like Phil Howard's intergovernmental, the IPCC equivalent that he wants to build for How do you see us fit in with that? So basically, my question is about the sort of context in the landscape and how we can position ourselves to be unique, and maximize our utility. So that's my question. It's a huge question. I apologize, but any
No
thoughts on
worries.
that would be appreciated.
There were 3 questions. I have thoughts. I think the first thing I would like to state off the top is that I don't want to be overly prescriptive, because I do feel like there was a small core stateside here that was looking at this for the last year, and I don't think that that's sufficient to answer all the questions. So that's number one, just to be clear, my thoughts may not be where we land. It's just been where I've been stewing. So with regards to how governments are involved, I mean, one, something at this scale is only going to work if they back it financially, like they did the CERN. So, and with the CERN, it was like a model of funding in perpetuity based on their GDP. I don't think it needs to necessarily be that high, but maybe there's a similar model. And unlike things like the European External Action Service or EDMO, it can't be renegotiated every couple of years, because that doesn't give us the long-term ability to do that. So one, government funds, but two, what's happening now is we've got governments introducing legislation like the Online Harms Bill in the UK. And I don't think that they have a very great understanding for what those interventions they propose will mean. And then how do you measure that? So there's these measurement issues and gaps that they have that I think they'll struggle to try to answer on their own. So what I see them being is providing those problems. And if we have an independent research facility, perhaps there are ways we can create models where we can have a multi-stakeholder approach to doing that type of analysis and understanding. So that's where I see government fitting in. Tech is tricky. This is one of the reasons why. So Stephen's been privy to a lot of like back documents. So the report that he mentioned on the council is forthcoming. I think it will be published by May, and I'll be happy to share that then. But also some mapping documents that we have. We haven't actually mapped industry into the equation because we don't want this to be compromised. That being said, one of the key questions for the council is, what kind of funding models should be applied here? And what kind of mechanisms exist? Should we agree as a community that industry should be paying because they are part of a problem? How can money be taken from them in a way that does not compromise the independence of the research institution? So this is a key question for the council to work out. I think that it would be great at some point if this center was independent, that industry could also be included in doing multi-stakeholder assessment of interventions or threats or whatever is necessary from their platform. The reason being is that they are struggling themselves to try to grapple with some of the interventions that they're making. At a policy level, I can promise you that the vast majority aren't even being measured. The ones that they probably have tried to study might include things that are automatic interventions. So anything that happens on the back end as a kind of product feature is the one place they might be studying. But at the same time, they can't really engage researchers because that will compromise the independence of researchers if they go inside to try to do that. So we do need some sort of mechanism if we want to have trust in our modern information environment, whereby we can facilitate research between stakeholders. Now, I want to park that because I think that how that works is extremely tricky and is something that this community needs to sort out together to answer. And then your last question was, how does this fit into other existing initiatives? So great question. What we've been doing is trying to identify leaders who are already working on a problem set that feeds into something like IRI, including Phil. And so he's calling it the IPIE, the Intergovernmental Panel for the Information Environment, although I don't think they're engaging government. So what we've been doing is working with the likes of him, Rebecca Tromble, who's working on the DSA mechanism for data access, and we've invited them to be part of the council so that they can share what they're doing with this community, and we're not duplicating and we're not overlapping and we're getting ahead faster. So I see this council as functioning in two ways. One is to work to get answers that would inform the operations of something like IRI. And at another level, being a information sharing vehicle such that this wider research community can actually be on the same page and move ahead together towards a shared goal much more quickly.
Okay, thanks. Philip, I guess your hand has been patiently up.
Hi everyone. Hi Alicia. Thanks for the talk. It's me, Philip. It's very nice to see this laid out again so clearly. So thanks for that. And I couldn't agree more on the whole effort, of course. I have two questions. So first of all, I would agree that, or at least I feel that there is this kind of paradigm shift that also, of course, motivates all this. That after data protection, I think we are now kind of feeling this responsibility as the public or the civil society to kind of do something with that data, and coordinating is necessary in order to be at least, if at all, a counterweight to all those data scientists working at the companies. That's how I see it, like that. The public needs to create this counterweight, and we need a lot of expertise. And in research, there is expertise, and I think that's cool. So my first question would be, I think this paradigm shift was somehow initiated, at least in the research community for me, through the DSA and the potential right to data access. How would you see the IRI in relation to the DSA and this Article 40, I think it is by now? And the second question, I think that was already talked about, is the role of industry. And I think so I see that, or if I understood you correctly, really on the research side, on the academic research side of things, and that part is coordinated. And then, of course, there are regulatory bodies also, and then there's industry, and this is also how you see it. That's what I wanted to make sure. Or should it be a place where everybody comes together and practitioners or industry talks to researchers, and that could be another.
So my sense is that something like this center needs to be multi-stakeholder. I think it needs to be driven by civil society, academics, from the outset. If it isn't, I have many worries about capture. And it's really easy, I think, to leave that broader community out if we don't lead. And I think that there's reasons for that. It's really hard. I was just at something recently. Global Affairs Canada hosted a conference, and it had the G7 rapid response mechanism focal point people there. And they talk about civil society in this broad monolithic sense, as if it's like really easy to just engage all of us. But we're actually maybe not that well organized amongst ourselves, even amongst, you might get like groups around a specific discipline. You might get, people who are doing investigations, they may actually come together at some point, but it's really hard to actually get to us and corral us. So at the same time, it's also easy for us to be kind of picked apart and, this very careful selection of who gets dealt with. And I think that is a big risk. So this is why I turn to this broader community and try to find ways to galvanize us to lead it, essentially. So I think it needs to be led by civil society, but it should be multi-stakeholder because of the problem set. And because the information environment is a complex system that involves all of these stakeholders and its relation to democracy, there's no other way around that. Now, the questions are how? How does that get structured in a way that ensures researcher independence? I don't necessarily have that answer, and it's something that I think that the community needs to come together to do. How does this relate to DSA? So I think the DSA is set to unlock data that we previously didn't have. And so that's amazing. I think the bigger concern is the research community going to be able to capitalize on that access to data? There's a few problems. One is that it's likely, and rightfully so, that the mechanism to get that data access may be very burdensome and challenging for research institutions to be able to get through that hurdle. So is there going to be a need for capacity building support that can help researchers get access to that data? Is that something that IRI can help with? Possibly. I think then there's another issue of we could have all the data in the world that we want, but if we don't have the engineering resources and infrastructure to make sense of that data, it's also pointless. And to circle back, I think there's like NetsDG made data available. My understanding is that many researchers don't actually go and get it. Now, is it because the data isn't useful? Is it because there's a cost associated with getting it? Is it because the process for getting it is challenging? I don't know, but I would hate to see the promise of the DSA fall short because the other ideas of like, or the other issues of making use of that data, accessing it, et cetera, haven't been thought through. So maybe this is a place that can help with that.
Thank you. Just quick responses. I was recently at a meeting where I exactly heard the first time about the data access through the NetsDG. When I realized I didn't know about that, then this actually increased my fears about exactly the same happening with the DSA. And that would be a pity. So that's why I also started to lobbying. And I think people are more aware than for the NetsDG access. So that's good. And in these meetings, I realized that no one is really clear about how this data access will look like. You said something, a problem is that we are currently working project-based and small groups. I totally see that. I think in these baby steps will not capture the whole environment. But I think as far as I understand legal text, I always thought that the DSA is actually thought or envisioned like that we have one specific research question, one risk. We say polarization through in the election in Spain this year, whatever. We want to do this study, and then we apply for data and we get this data, and it can only be used for this project. And that would be really a pity. If this would be more open, or the interpretation of the law would be more, let's say, flexible, then gathering that data in a central space, making it usable for more groups, creating bigger kind of projects that span different data sets, that would be great. But I think, at least I don't know if that will be the case. So that's my big question mark so far. So for one question, for example, is just, can data that you applied for a specific request shared later on with other groups or not? Like, how is that regular? I mean, we will have to follow some open data rules probably, yeah, but I'm not sure if the DSA will cover that, for example.
And this is, to me, why it's so key that, like, we need to create some sort of vehicle that brings the different, like, let's call them leaders on specific problem sets together to share information, right? So like Rebecca is being hit up 1,000 different ways, trying to make sure that she can talk to a wider research community. Perhaps through this kind of council structure, we can make that easier. And it also gives us access to be able to understand what is going on, so we can think through the next 5 to 10 steps that may unlock something else that aren't going to necessarily be thought through in that kind of more narrow process. So I see, back to Stephen's question about how this is unique, we don't have a whole lot that's bringing everything together. We don't have a lot that connects all the dots. And so I see this exercise as being very much about that. How do we connect, like, I hate using this term, but like a network of networks together to move ahead more quickly. And if all else fails, at least maybe we would have created a de facto IRE in a network, in a community that possibly can scale up, maybe not as great as an institution will give us, but it will be something more than what we have today.
Lucy, I think.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. At the start, you alluded to how efforts to counter issues such as disinformation have been politicized. How would you go about, or the way of putting, I suppose, is, what are your thoughts on gathering public support for an initiative like this across the political spectrum without running into those same issues?
Yeah, and I'm not sure that there is a perfect way to avoid it entirely. I think, though, some of it is in the way in which we perhaps consider studying the information environment. So another reason why I think the system is so necessary is that if we just look at specific threats and specific examples, that's easily politicized because we're doing is we're taking examples in real time of problem sets that are falling along political fault lines, essentially. And what we really need to do is find some other ways to study the system in which all of this stuff is occurring, that can be perhaps at least more objective in its assessment of that system. So if we could find out what kinds of, I keep coming back to this one because again, I'm obsessed with the system in which this stuff sits, but like what actually makes for a healthy information ecosystem in the context of democracy? Right now, we don't know. We have ideas, like we say things like a free and fair media, but then of course we're upset if that free and fair media becomes really biased and is just, you know, spewing what some will say is disinformation. And so it's, I think, more a question of like, how do we get out to a higher level of analysis, perhaps, that is not necessarily about specific topics. Now, that's not to say that we can't study specific examples and topics, but we may need to be looking for other ways to make sense of this world, this informational world around us. So some examples are like, maybe literacy rates are extremely important. Maybe access to being able to use the internet and internet speeds and what kind of media consumption patterns people have. Maybe those kinds of systemic things are equally as important or could provide answers if we looked at them in total. But I'm not going to be naive. I think that there's always going to be a great chance that this is going to be politicized and people will potentially think it's creepy. I think taking a community-based approach and also keeping in mind that we need to engage citizens somehow from the outset and that they need to perhaps be more involved in research to be able to trust it and understand it is key. I think actually this is Laura Smiley, Stephen, the concern that what we'll have is just another science problem, right? Where the scientists aren't understood or their message isn't reaching a wider public. How do we countermand that from the beginning? And I think that's an institutional issue that we need to sort out in the development phase. What kind of mechanisms would work?
Yeah, perfect. I agree. And maybe I can pivot to somebody else on this call. Jane, can I put you on the spot? And do you have any thoughts on deliberation or something similar as a public involvement in this? We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks so much for the talk, Alicia. I thought it was really interesting and definitely something that is well needed. I think your work will be cut out trying to get, 40 governments to pay $1 million a year each, but you never know. We have done some work recently actually looking at the potential for citizen deliberation to be involved in kind of pre-bunking and in dispelling misperceptions. We've done it in relation to COVID and to climate change. Actually, I just had a paper published this week in Political Communication on it in relation to COVID. And what we find is that different types of people obviously are inclined to believe groups of experts, but other types of people are inclined to believe other people, and particularly people like them. And it reaches a different audience and reaches it in a different way. So it is actually possible to bring together a randomly selected group of people, 100 people. It can be done online, and a report issued about what those people found about the science. And when you actually disseminate that to the wider public, it does actually reach different parts than just pure science communication. So if you can have that kind of deliberative communication of a mini public on top of scientific reports, it can definitely help with the communication to the wider public and to trusting and so on. In fact, there was a section on this recently in the Biden Summit for Democracy, which was held last week. And quite a few, as I understand it, they haven't finished. A lot of the countries are signing up to different commitments, but there were quite a lot of countries that were signing up to the idea of global deliberation and to be involved with scientific communication, including in Latin America and in Africa. So that could be something. The State Department were quite in favour of it as well at that summit. So it could be something that would actually help even with the communication with the stakeholders in building it in the first place, I would think.
Fantastic, Jane. I didn't know that. Do you have a link to that initiative?
Yeah, I can send you a link to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, thank you. That's correct. Yeah, so there's your answer.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's exactly the kind of thinking that we need. And Jane, I mean, we would welcome if you would like to be involved. I think this is the other issue, is that to build something like this requires so many different disciplines, even in the thinking through how this gets structured. I'm not going to be pretending that I'm an expert in any of those things. I studied war studies. I know about war and propaganda and Russia, like those very narrow things. And so we need people like you, like we need people who have experience in different aspects of what would be key to developing this. So I would love to talk. I would love to.
Yeah, more than happy for you to
Okay,
put me in the loop or
right.
drop me an email.
Terrific. Then maybe, Alicia, if I can go from the sort of general landscape to the specifics as a next step. I sent you an email a little while ago. You got that. Okay, so do you want to talk about that in this forum and tell us a little more about that? Are you comfortable with that?
Absolutely. So there's a few kind of initial steps. So what we've been, and when I keep saying we, it's a very small team at Carnegie that I have, and it's been mostly Sam Lai and myself trying to build these things out. We're in a bit of a chicken and an egg moment where it's bigger than my team can handle, and so we are now trying to get towards this next step of like, how do we actually make this bigger and functional and sane for everybody involved? So Stephen, Philip, there's been a group of us who have been discussing how to essentially bring that council together and how do we move forward. So one is that in a few weeks, actually, Stephen, I'm going to try to do a virtual call with that community. So it'll be a mix of the people who have agreed to step forward on questions, some of the other leaders, like I mentioned, like Phil and Rebecca, and just a level setting of where we are, what we're doing, et cetera. We will also be creating a Slack channel that, yes, we will have a pro account that we just set up yesterday. So I'll send an email around to anybody who wants to be part of this community. We will have that as well. But Stephen and I are also working to have a smaller meeting in Berlin, which will be a brainstorming session on immediate next steps. So how do we get a council and a secretariat for it housed? There is a donor that is expressing interest in perhaps and possibly supporting that over the next year or two. I think they're leaning towards the idea of a new nonprofit being created in Europe that would house that. Again, I want to leave that to the community to decide and have that open. And we're looking at having that in-person meeting in Berlin on June 15th at the Max Planck Institute.
Yes, that I received confirmation that they are committed to make that happen. Yes. So if you tell me that you're committed to making it happen, then I can get.
Oh, I'm committed. Oh, no. We're like, that's,
We're
yeah. No, I mean, I was activating backup plans yesterday, like just seeing that because we're gonna do June 15th.
It's all done, and it's not going to be in the MPI, but it's going to be nearby. They're renting a facility off-site because of that conflict with the Institute. Leave that with me. I'll deal with it, and we'll finalize that on Monday. So you can definitely plan for the 15th of June, and anybody else who's here on this call and wants to be in Berlin at a very nice time of year. It's the 15th of June is a good date to aim for. Christoph will be there anyway, so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry.
I can confirm, and I'm back at the Institute on Monday and actually check in person with Maren and so on, what the room situation or this Hanak house it's called would be.
Yeah, it's in the Hanak house. Yeah.
But it will happen, yes.
Yes.
So actually that one should be pretty interesting too, because just like by virtue of who's kind of stepping forward. So Michael Pomancier at the NSF has agreed to try to answer the whole funding model question. He's been looking at that in the context of the US. And he's been trying to corral donors. So actually on the sides of the Nobel Foundation event that they're having in DC in May, he's organizing a session with the donor community to try to get them to understand that if we want to have an understanding of impact of things like threats and interventions, we need longer term research conducted, and the current funding model is broken. So he has said he should be able to join us, which would be great. The donor that's interested, this is why we had to move it to the 15th, unfortunately, to have them at the table to help us brainstorm what they think we should be doing and be engaged in that. So they will be there. That's the Alfred Landecker Foundation. But yes, please, if you're interested in the giant cat herding of the council, I would please come to Berlin. Just let us know, and let us know if you want to be in that Slack as well.
Okay, superb. Yes, very good. Well, I can imagine quite a few people on this call will be at least interested in the Slack, and you know, we can always move it forward from there. Okay, wonderful. Any other comments, questions, ideas from anyone?
Well, I wanted to ask, maybe, I don't know if this is too early for that or no, but we also have on this call some early career researchers, and those are usually the ones that are dealing with the tools and as you said, like there is a need to try and list all the tools that the community needs, and I was wondering if there's anything that we can move forward with something that the community can maybe bring to the table.
Well, there's much. I want to like roll back. There is this one big elephant in the room, in that I don't want to be a bottleneck in this. So I am also seeking advice and ideas of how to like create a distributed network where there isn't a bottleneck. So any thoughts on organizing like that would be extremely helpful at this point in time. And yes, so I think there's a couple of different things. Like we did a bit of we have a researcher at Princeton who went to try to compile a list of tools. I think it would be really interesting to have that shared and circulated to see what we've missed, because it was done by looking at academic papers and what was mentioned. And that may not have, that's not the only way in which we can find more. The second thing is, so Princeton is going to start an accelerator. So it'll be one of many steps to try to start to build initial infrastructure in the meantime. And they had identified 5 tools through this process that we had over the last year of what could be built. And Jake is looking for partners on building those. And also, if anybody's already ahead on building something like that, he would rather work with them instead of being duplicative. So I'd be happy to share and connect what he's doing and where he's at on that. The other thing too is there's pockets of things picking up. I know that Rebecca plans to do a session in early June with the data repositories, at least in the US, and some of the infrastructure builders to try to get them to the table. That doesn't help the earlier level researchers. But I would also just add, and this is where I was going with this, is that I think one model is we try to find leaders who are willing to be the representative or corral their specific community. So it would be really great to find somebody who wants to kind of be that leader in the tool building world, to speak on their behalf and engage with them and bring news of what they're doing and keep track of what they're doing. That I think may get us to a distributed network faster.
Yeah, I mean, well, maybe Alicia, can you get Almog and Jake in touch with each other, and they can just start a conversation. Go
Gladly.
Yeah.
Happy to do that.
I mean, I totally agree with you, Alicia. I think this is really exciting, potentially an amazing initiative, and we have to be innovative from the beginning about how to do it. And that means sort of a fairly loose co-leadership arrangement, I think, so we don't create a bottleneck from the beginning. You know, and do things that Jane just put on the table with these, you know, getting the public involved from very early on. I think there's a lot of opportunity here for really interesting things. And yeah, now I know you have to run, don't you, Alicia? You said you have to go at the top of the hour.
I can be a little bit late. Actually, there's a thing adjacent to the Nobel Foundation event with the UNDP that was soliciting ideas around tools for countering or for addressing information pollution, and I'm on the committee assessing the.
That's the gig in DC in May. Right. Okay. Good. Are you going to be there?
I can't go to the Nobel Foundation event because Carnegie's annual retreat is there. I'm going to leave early from the retreat to attend the NSF Corral donor thing.
Okay. Because I'll be in DC for that both days.
I get in on Tuesday. So if you're in on Tuesday, I'll be in DC.
No, Wednesday, I think. I'll let you know. I'll maybe we'll overlap. Damn, now I forgot. There was something I was going to ask you. Oh, right. Yes. Is it worth, that's what I'm into hands. Is it worth us, whoever us is, right, to get together on Zoom early next week or something and to have a sort of precursor, yeah, you're okay. Leave that with me, and I will suggest that to people for Monday or Tuesday, maybe Ralph, Anastasia, Philip, and I, and whoever else wants to be part of it. Just a kind of a small nuts and bolts meeting. Okay. So
yeah, yes,
great stuff. Okay.
I'm a human and I'm extremely flawed and I'm a task-oriented person. So there's a bad habit of like, I will just do all the things, and that is not sustainable. So I'm also just being very, very open with the community that this cannot be allowed. Laura and I have a pact in which we tell each other that this is not feasible.
Very good. That's good. And yes, we need to crowdsource it and discipline ourselves to achieve that. I agree. Yeah. Okay, terrific. Then anything else? We're almost out of time. Any last minute thoughts?
Well, I like Philip's idea about doing a survey to see who's out in the community. I would be really interested. I mean, we've got some kind of like some initiatives that are going forward. So I admit that the thing that I'm most interested in making this happen is really how do we frame and study the information environment as a system. So Heidi Tworik and David Broniatowski and I are trying to take that on and develop a proposal for how we might look at it. And Dhanaraj Thakur at CDT is looking at how to increase diversity. And what we're finding is that there's a lot of ways in which those working groups may end up engaging a wider community to try to find out who's doing what. So all of that is to say, I would be very interested in doing something sooner, perhaps. The bigger question, the thing that I'm always worried about, Philip, is that if the community grows too big and we have no structure for incorporating, that just feels like a sleep removing exercise. But maybe once we get through June and that initial meeting and have a little bit better sense of who's stepping forward, that would be the right time to do it. So really open on that, especially if you want to lead on that, that would be great.
Okay, all right. No, that sounds, I think we're all on the same page. So I will get back to you, Alicia, very shortly about having a meeting. Even if it's only half an hour, just to kind of maybe divvy up some tasks and think of what we can do. And I'll encourage everyone who's on this call now to send me an email or Discord or whatever medium we use with follow-up ideas or suggestions. If there's anything you haven't expressed during the meeting but you want to share with me, do it now, right after we get off the call, and then I can take it from there. All right. All right, let's herd some cats. Sounds wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
And thanks for coming, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, you can stop